Hi. So good morning. It isn't yet a book. It's currently a haphazard kind of patchy script on my laptop and iPad. So it's called Barbershop Chronicles, and it began like this. A few years ago, I learned about a project to teach barbers the very basics of counseling, just so they would know how to handle stuff that came out in conversation with their clients. And I thought that was fascinating, and I wanted to be a resident poet just to see that unfold and to write poems about it. But the more I thought about it, I realized that it could be a lot bigger. Rather than just writing poems about it, to gather those conversations, try to do something else. And initially, I just wanted to stick with barbershops in South London, Nigerian barbershops. But I thought bigger and bigger to what it is now, which is a way to document how Africa is changing the continent, and the conversations that are happening in barbershops here in London and what they think about barbers and black men on the continent. So I just spent 6 weeks traveling through Africa. I went to South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Ghana. I spent a week in each place just hanging around with barbers and talking. So what I'm going to try and give you is a sense of what I experienced, the kind of conversations we talked about, and just how things are changing and how complicated and difficult it can be sometimes to figure out who you are and who you're supposed to be. So I'll start with one of what I found in the barbershops I visited here in London. So most of the conversations were about racism, about what black men think about other black men and Africans, specifically what the Caribbeans thought about the Africans and vice versa, and the different attitudes that exist towards the same topics, from just discipline to sports to football to basketball to alcohol even. For instance, there was a Caribbean man who believes that Africans do not drink because there are not that many pubs that are frequented by Africans. However, when I went to South Africa, the very opposite existed. They have an unhealthy attitude with alcohol. It was ridiculous. But just backtracking a little bit, one of the earliest conversations I had was about discipline. It was in a barbershop in South London, and a client was complaining to a barber about an incident that happened the day previously, where there was a young boy, about 13-year-old, who sat down and he hadn't told his mother where he was going. So she ran into the barbershop. She sort of knew he was there, and she asked, "Why didn't you tell me you were here?" And the boy replied, "Because I'm in the shop. I'm sorry, I'm in the chair in it." And the response was rude because A, implied that the mother could not see that his hands were tied, and the client took that as a sign of just rudeness, really, from a young boy to his mother. And then the conversation morphed to discipline, and he was complaining about how in Africa, in Ghana specifically, if the conversation would have gone down in a completely different way. If the boy had said that to his mother, someone would have slapped him, would have been disciplined, or been rebuked harshly. However, he could not do that, or the barber felt that he could not do that here in London because things had changed. And specifically, he blamed the government and David Cameron. And another another thing is that in barbershops, conversations, they can begin just between you and your barber, but very soon they just blossom into a whole debate and everyone is piling in. So another client kind of just spoke from the back, saying, "What, you expect David Cameron to come and slap your son on your behalf?" Like, really, I don't think the conservative of the big society stretches to that just yet. And so it kind of moved from then, talking about discipline, to how there were double standards then in how African men felt they could discipline their children, because the state and legislation and the law feeds into that. This double standard also existed in a conversation I had with two Ghanaian men 3 weeks ago, and they were talking about the English language and how it forces a double think sometimes. And by that, there are some bits of the Ghanaian language or ways of thinking, a concept that just do not exist within the English language. Therefore, you cannot translate those concepts into families here, or say grandfathers to grandsons. There's a gulf of understanding. So the conversation moved on to double standards within football. This is something that is discussed in infinite detail in barbershops. It moved on to football, and particularly an incident between Suarez and Evra. Are you guys aware of this incident? Okay, so Suarez apparently called Evra a Negro or a nigger or something of the sort on the match, and apparently he got away with it. And people were complaining, well, there's double standards, and how John Terry did something similar. And then he got away with it because he's the son of the soil and was the captain of the England football team, and he could get away with it. Whereas Suarez was rebuked because he was from South America and he was a foreigner on English soil. So these conversations about the duplicity and duality and double standards kind of spread through the conversation and through discussions about football specifically. In Nigeria, there were also discussions about football, and it was claimed that the biggest tribe in Africa wasn't the Hausas or the Yorubas or the Gas or the Ashantis. Instead, it was Chelsea fans. It used to be Manchester United fans, but their main chief left the throne, and by that they were referring to Alex Ferguson. And so the conversation had changed. And one thing I discovered, again, within the barbershop was that football politics was bleeding into tribal politics. So, for instance, it was bad enough being Ghanaian in Nigeria, but if you're Ghanaian and supported West Ham, it was just over. So, which was kind of fascinating to think about how much it trickles down, just football culture and the bond it creates among men. And like when the barber in Nigeria commented that because of the tribe of Chelsea supporters, you could travel anywhere in the world and find extended families, and there would be a shorthandness and an intimacy, all to do with the game. One of the conversations that was talked about within that was about I guess two intense football fans. A Nigerian was complaining about Kenyan football culture. And I was a Kenyan football fan who supported Arsenal, and he made a bet with a Man United supporter. And the bet was to do with property, i.e. his house, and the other guy bet his car and his flat. And the deal was that if Man United won, one guy would get his flat, and the other guy, if Arsenal won, the other guy would get not only his flat but his his car. And then Man United won that match, so the Arsenal supporter had to give up his flat. And literally, the Man United fan went in and just bundled him everything, his possessions, his family, his wife and kids, just kicked him out of the flat. And something else also happened where a man committed suicide when Arsenal lost. So again, intense worshipping of football culture, particularly the Premiership, existed in all of the countries that I visited. In Kenya, also, there's a rugby. Rugby is as worshipped as football is, which I did not expect because none of West Africa was mostly football. And what was kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? What came along with rugby and the dynamics and the relationship between that and football was the same class system that exists here, where I think a lot of upper middle class people are kind of more into rugby than everyone else is into football. Would you think that's fair, or am I? Yeah. So the same dynamic existed in Kenya, which was fascinating for me. One thing that a lot of men were discussing was about money and the rising financial equality between the genders. And by that I mean women were increasingly being paid the same amounts of money as men were. And I spoke to a man who worked in investment, and he talked about how this is going to affect family dynamics in Kenya because he believed that the women would become more autonomous. And whereas that is fine in most places, in Kenya, everyone cheats. Everyone cheats. Everyone cheats. I can't stress this because I found it was fascinating, but it was so open. Pretty much 80% of the women and the men in relationships were cheating with other people. Again, the first few days there, I did not believe that. I thought this was ridiculous until I would get into conversations with people, with women and with men, and they would just tell me the same narrative. One of the, I guess, the saddest moments was speaking with a taxi driver who claimed that he had just stopped he'd just given up on the idea of ever having a relationship because of that. He wanted to he wanted to date women who were either not from Kenya or who worked for the United Nations, because again, they were not from Kenya as well. That was just all he was focused on. And he talked about dating 2 or 3 women and how it just really broke his heart. And it was interesting to see a man who was who really wanted a meaningful relationship but could not believe he could have one with anyone in his country who lived around him. Um, so, am I speaking too fast? Are you with me? So, yeah. Great. So, in Uganda, the same kind of relationships and the conversations were kind of prevalent in barbershops. So Ghana was mostly about discipline and fatherhood. Kenya, it was about rugby versus football and dynamics within that. And Uganda, it was unanimously about love. I spoke to a barber called Simon, and we sat down, and he asked me if I had a girlfriend, and I said no. And he said, why? I said, because, I'm just not in that space. And he did not believe me. He thought that as a Nigerian, it was ridiculous that I didn't have at least 2 or 3 girlfriends. This stereotype precedes us. So I asked him, how many girlfriends do you have? And he said, I have 2. I said, why? He said, because I'm a man. And that was how simple the logic was for him, which I found quite humbling. And, instantly I began to say, okay, that's kind of wrong. I tried to rebuke him. But he told me that one of the girlfriends knew about it and it was completely fine. And there was an openness about relationships, which staggered me in Uganda because they're relatively conservative compared to West Africans, for instance. I spoke to another man who made the distinctions between godly love and human love and how he sought godly love in a relationship. And by godly love, he meant love that was kind of rational, whereas human love was over emotional, and you find yourself doing things with the person you loved, regardless of, of just circumstance, of how you just fall wholeheartedly in love with someone and deny like old friendships or even members of your family. And he thought that that was extremely disastrous, not just to culture, not just to family life, but to, Uganda national identity. So he was looking for godly love and to have that to dominate his relationships. Which I found really fascinating. I also talked to another man who told me that romance was completely out of the way. Like when he goes about looking for relationships, or rather he spoke specifically about his relationship. He met this lady, he didn't dine her, they didn't go to dinner or anything. They just started seeing each other. Then after a couple of years, they moved in together. And then she got pregnant, she had 2 kids by him. And then after that, he began to consider getting married to her. And he says this is how it now must be done because sometimes if the lady cheats on him or vice versa, the family could just break apart and then the marriage would be a sin, not just to God, but also to his bank account. And this was his way of securing the relationship and securing just that the children will grow up in a healthy environment built on trust and commonality and respect, etc. The last person I spoke to about relationships in Uganda was a hotel attendant, and he told me about the dynamics that exist between romance in Uganda and romance here, using Hollywood as a crux for this conversation. He said specifically, when you watch Hollywood films about romance, it kind of culminates in a guy is on a mountaintop threatening to jump or something, and the lady or the object of his affection realizes her true love for him and comes and saves him at the last moment, and everything is fine. He says, however, in Africa, if you jump, you will die. That that Hollywood film should come with a warning, do not try this at home. So I left Uganda and I moved to Nigeria. And Nigeria is that critical mass of extreme capitalism meets extreme informality. And by that I mean everyone wants money for nothing, really. And one of the conversations I had was a man telling me about this kind of culture that exists now where young women, when they begin to date a man, within 2 to 3 weeks of that, should begin to ask him for money to do her hair, to get, deep body massages or whatever. And each month, this monthly allowance, as she would call it, can go into the tens of thousands of naira. And a single woman could have 3 or 4 benefactors as such each month. That is just money simply for dating. And he was saying that relationships were becoming kind of almost exclusively transactional, as in you do this for me and I will do this for you. And I think that this kind of was the umbrella under which a lot of conversations that I was having about relationships existed, and how because of this drive towards wealth or Western standards of living, a lot of people were becoming increasingly money focused, and that undermined or overshadowed just what I guess simple love-based relationships. In Nigeria, also, this conversation came up about the use of the word nigger and what that meant. Before I went to Nigeria, I had a similar conversation here in London, and a man commented that he doesn't use it and he doesn't think it can ever be used positively. This was a Nigerian man, and he said that if a black man ever called him that word, regardless of how friendly or how well it was intended, he would beat that man down. Even more so than if it was called that by a white man or a South American man. And I asked why, and he said because of the legacy and the history of the word, that the idea of recolonizing that word and using it for positive kind of situations was just ridiculous, that it could not, because the origins of the word was entirely negative and it could only ever be used that way. Another man kind of chimed up in the barbershop and claimed and disagreed entirely. And he talked about the first time he heard the word was listening to a Tupac album called Strictly for My Niggas. And he thought that that was entirely positive because it was stretched and used to include all men, regardless of nationality, but all men of a certain hue right across the world. So again, even within the use of the word, there are conflicts in Africa and here. The most interesting place, though, or rather the most, yeah, I'll use the word interesting reductively, was South Africa. There, the conversation came up about offensive words, and rather than nigger or anything of the sort, or even boy, it was the word kafir, which was used by the white South Africans during the period of apartheid. And one of the men talked about how he grew up in a neighborhood where he was the only black family there. And he talked about his mother being beaten by some of the local neighborhoods. And his mother called someone to help, and the person came and was beating as well. And I spoke with a sort of anthropologist in a barbershop, and the conversation just spiraled out of control. And he talked about how South Africa was fractured for a plethora of reasons, one of which was the fact that when Nelson Mandela was released, he kind of diffused the rising tension that was existing culturally, racially, and when he did that, a lot of the black men and colored men, the term was used, a lot of them never got to release all the anger that grew during the period of apartheid. And he talked about how apartheid was a mixture of slavery, of segregation, of colonization, of capitalism, of racism. For instance, a lot of colored people, which I didn't know at the time, were just paid in wine from working, in the vineyards. So there's a strong culture of alcoholism, a lot of colored communities in South Africa. And when Nelson Mandela became president, he just diffused all of that tension. And what happens now is that the generations of men who grew up with all of that frustration trickling down psychologically, physically, etc., and they just never got to explode and to release all of that. And he cited that as a reason why there's lots of violence between men and women in South Africa, and why there's this blossoming rape culture, why is the capital is leading in terms of HIV prevalency. South Africa is just far outweighs everywhere else in the world, and he cited this as one of the reasons why that just a lot of the men there were frustrated and never got to vent their frustration. So I guess in closing, I think I've just about run over time. In closing, these are the kind of issues that I came across, and my play is going to be an anthology of these conversations, and I'm going to be trying to distill them into narratives, into back and forths that make sense. I should finish writing it in 2 weeks. For the National Theatre, and hopefully it will be on the stages towards the end of the year or early next year. Thank you.